The Xbox 360 was Microsoft's greatest achievement in the home console gaming space, and it sold almost 3 times as many systems as they did during their initial entry with the Xbox. The 360 may have sold less than the PlayStation 3 or the Wii, but won over the hearts of so many gamers and is easily considered to be one of the best gaming systems from Microsoft, if not the best. The 360 had significant hardware problems, but it left an absolutely lasting impression that got so many gamers excited for its successor. And the entire world was shocked when Microsoft's next system was unveiled. This is an all-in-one device that was a media center, a fully fledged gaming system, and a permanent part of your life. This is Microsoft's Xbox One, a very interesting idea that had no chance of surviving, and one that tarnished Microsoft's legacy forever. There was so much anticipation towards the Xbox One. As per every ending of a new generation, there were so many rumors that got everyone excited for the 8th generation of gaming. The 7th generation is a very popular one due to the very aggressive competition from all 3 major competitors with no definitive losers to really speak of, unless you include the Ouya in the mix. Admittedly, there was some disappointment in the air leading into the 2010s, as the Kinect was incredibly promising at first, but was quickly forgotten due to the many broken promises surrounding it. Most people loved the Xbox 360. I was definitely one of those people too. So in May of 2013, we finally got an official announcement of Microsoft's successor, a massive hardware box with every feature related to entertainment you would need for the coming years. This system was a full-blown media streaming entertainment system with the ability to now play Blu-ray discs with up to 1080p support. That was also a full-blown next-generation gaming system. This is the Xbox One, and this exact same presentation absolutely tarnished the delivery for their next-gen announcement, a delivery given by Don Mattrick. The Xbox One was set to require you to always connect to the internet, as it would validate licenses for your physically purchased games, which also made it so much more difficult to purchase or even borrow games from someone else for use on your own system, as these discs would be tied to a person's account. Now, due to these DRM issues associated with this system, gamers were supposed to include multiple people within the license of a single disc just to allow other people to play from that same disc. And if you ever wanted to give it away or sell it, then you would have to unlink the license from these accounts, which was going to make the situation around sharing games much more tedious than it needed to be. That's why the Xbox One needed to connect to the internet every 24 hours in order to validate all of this. Additionally, the new Xbox One Kinect was to be bundled with every single system, and it was a completely mandatory accessory where even if you decided to disconnect it after purchase, your system just wouldn't boot up at all without it. Kinect would always be plugged in and turned on while the Xbox One was in use, hence always pointing the lens at you. Additionally, when asked about what Microsoft intended to do about players who can't constantly log into the internet, Don Mattrick just said that there is another platform for them instead, and that is the Xbox 360. A very condescending response to even the biggest Xbox diehards. Obviously, nobody was okay with this, and there was a lot of backlash to Microsoft's announcement. When Sony struggled to make the PlayStation 3 succeed in the 7th generation console race, they took this opportunity to give themselves the greatest and most mundane PR boost in gaming history by showing that all you need to do to lend a game to someone else is simply hand it to them on PS4. After enough uproar, Microsoft reversed many of these decisions and gave us the Xbox One system that we know today. The Xbox One is massive and very heavy, resembling the launch model Xbox 360 in terms of those characteristics, but design-wise, it couldn't be any more different. This unit has this glossy black surface that looks very sleek, accompanied by these matte ridges on the other half. On the front, you will find a disk drive, a touch-sensitive eject button, and a power button which also touch sensitive and lights up when you power on the system. On the left, you will find a physical and pressable pairing button and a USB-A port. On the Mac, you will find a power supply port, an HDMI out port, SPDIF port, HDMI in port, 2 USB-A ports, a specialized port for the Kinect, an IR out port, and an Ethernet port. The reason for both of those HDMI ports is so that you can connect it to your TV for your normal use, and the other is so that you can connect other types of devices to it, such such as a Chromecast for casting content directly to your Xbox, among other things. The Xbox One also had a lot of flexibility when it came to audio setups, including that SPDIF port for connecting your system directly to a more sophisticated audio setup. These are things that get taken for granted, but can definitely be useful for the right user. One improvement to the Xbox One that never made its way into the Xbox 360 was the inclusion of a Blu-ray drive, which means that publishers can now fit bigger games into a single disc, but it was also helpful for the people who wanted to watch content from Blu-ray discs on their Xbox One. Now, Blu-ray discs could hold up to 25 gigs of data on a single layered disc and 50 gigs on a dual layered disc. The Xbox One also continues to use an external power supply, and this one is still pretty large, but not the worst one that Microsoft has ever sold with their consoles. I'm looking at the launch model Xbox 360's power supply for that. This unit also launched with a 500GB hard drive, which, while a huge improvement from the largest 360 hard drive available, it was still a bit small, considering how much storage something like Call of Duty would take up later on. However, one of the biggest improvements to the Xbox One's ecosystem was the inclusion of one of the best controllers made that works just fine for other platforms as well, the Xbox One controller, which is truly incredible. I was a huge fan of the Xbox 360 controller, but I much prefer the Xbox One controller. It has a more comfortable grip, with a nice textured back that gives it a more premium feel. The thumbsticks feel much higher quality, and it's easier to grip them, not to mention that the sticks lasted longer than what they did on any 360 controller I ever used. The buttons look and feel quite nice, and the D-pad has a much more usable clicky design. The triggers feel smooth, and the shoulder buttons feel nice and responsive. The Xbox One controller also features a micro USB port for charging if you use an optional rechargeable battery with it, and wired use if you won't use any batteries at all. Unfortunately, they still opted to use AA batteries for this controller, which has the benefit of lasting longer than your typical lithium-ion battery, but it requires an additional purchase every time that they run out. Either way, this was a very solid controller and a very noticeable improvement compared to the 360 controller. And of course, the new Kinect sensor is an important part of this conversation, as it was bundled with every single VCR model. This is yet another massive camera accessory that admittedly looks very sleek and has many of the same design cues and accents that the Xbox One has. This version of the Kinect offers a better experience than the earlier version with a higher resolution sensor that now supports 1080p. This was a nice improvement, and the games that utilize a sensor were a better experience with it. Now, thankfully, even though this accessory was bundled, it wasn't mandatory to use any longer. The system launched at $500, being considered quite expensive. Microsoft removed many of those issues that were going to plague the system before it even launched, meaning that the Xbox One can now play used discs without any problems or tediousness. The Kinect was no longer required at all, and it no longer needed to connect to the internet every 24 hours to validate anything. But you still had to buy them together whether you liked it or not, as Microsoft wasn't selling their system in any other way at all. The interface for this system was also modernized to oblivion, changing the menu set, and everything felt a lot snappier. It felt like navigating a media library, which was very different from what we got used to with literally every other console before it, but it still works, even if I do prefer the Xbox 360's latest interface, as I find it easier to navigate. But this interpretation makes sense, as the Xbox One was mostly being promoted for its prowess as a media player that doubles as a gaming system. This wasn't a good decision, but that still made everyone wonder, what would the gaming experience even be like on the Xbox One? The Xbox 360 was generally considered to be a friendly platform to develop games for, or even port titles to, especially when compared to the PlayStation 3 at the time. The Xbox One is an x86-based system, which makes porting or developing for it easier, as it's a familiar framework for many developers. Now, this generation, we truly started to teeter the line between high-quality video game visuals and games that looked pretty realistic overall. Now, thanks to the great attention to detail in many models, environments, and particles, among many other things. Additionally, the goal was to be able to play games at 1080p. Now, just considering that this system had been in development for quite some time before its launch, it happened to have a pretty decent launch lineup of games with several sports titles, of course, but Forza Motorsport 5 did a great job at showing off what this generation could be like on the Xbox One. The shadows and reflections were greatly improved, offering a much more immersive experience, and one that definitely captivated the hearts of Forza fans. Not to mention that just 1 year later, an enhanced version of one of the biggest games of all time, GTA 5, was launching on the Xbox One. However, Microsoft's platform was definitely struggling, as the PlayStation 4 was stealing a lot of that market share thanks to their focus on software. The Microsoft, on the other hand, had a lot of the same games that were also available on the PS4, but most people noticed that there are performance discrepancies between both versions of a single game. The Xbox One version of a game usually runs worse than it did on its competitor, and noticeably so, especially when looking at these side by side. That's because the Xbox One ran a lot of games at 720p instead of 1080p, which the PS4 could achieve more easily. This could have been due to development discrepancies between platforms, but many noticed that the Xbox One version of games just didn't really look as good. So third-party games were worse experienced on the Xbox One. What exclusives did Microsoft have in order to positively differentiate it from the PS4? Microsoft had exclusive games such as Killer Instinct Season 2, Gears of War 4, Ori and the Blind Forest, more Forza games, Quantum Break, Sunset Overdrive, and Cuphead. But the reality is that other exclusives that were meant to be huge from the start didn't have a great launch, including Sea of Thieves, a game that eventually became much better, but one that had a very rough launch. Xbox One was looking pretty dry in terms of the unique games output, but some of the games mentioned above are quite important to the Xbox One's library. But there was still a lot of gold to be found on the Xbox One, since a lot of those great games that made it onto multiple platforms also made it onto the system, which includes the revival of the Assassin's Creed series with Origins, awesome games like Monster Hunter World, Dark Souls 3, Red Dead Redemption 2, The Witcher 3, Hollow Knight, Mortal Kombat 10, Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, and of course even Shadow of War, even if it was a more controversial entry. Final Fantasy 15, which was also controversial, but one of my favorites, the Resident Evil 2 remake, then Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, among others. And while not initially available at launch, Microsoft did something with the Xbox One that Sony never really did with their system, and that is to make their console backwards compatible with select Xbox 360 and original Xbox games. This list started off a bit small, but continued to grow over time, making this a solid system for playing a decent chunk of older games. However, it cannot be denied that the Xbox One just wasn't getting nearly as much love as the PlayStation 4. In the midst of it all, Don Mattrick left Xbox, and the reins were eventually handed off to Phil Spencer, which means that during the earlier years of the Xbox One's life, they were going through multiple changes in leadership over at the Xbox division. As such, a lot of changes did eventually come to the Xbox One to try and recover as much goodwill as possible. One of those major changes to the Xbox One was an entirely new hardware revision released in 2016 in the form of the Xbox One S, a very significant quality of life upgrade. This is a much smaller version of the original that still packs all of its power, but looks even better and more modern with a much more understated look, and now features an entirely matte textured exterior with dotted openings around the top shelf for the air exhaust. The Blu-ray drive is still on the front. The One S uses only physical buttons for the eject, pairing, and power buttons. Additionally, Microsoft included an IR blaster on the front of the system, and that USB-A port that used to be on the side is now on the front as well. On the back, you will find both HDMI ports, with one of them being HDMI out and the other HDMI in, two USB-A ports, an IR out port, an SPDIF port, and an Ethernet port. That Connect port is entirely missing from this unit because Microsoft was already working on discontinuing the Connect later into 2017, and there was very little support for it whatsoever. And if you're interested in finding out more about what happened to the Connect, I made a separate mini documentary on it. Links will be found in the description. But clearly, Microsoft was getting ready to move on from their disastrous launch and many of the things associated with it. In fact, it was around this time where the Xbox One was picking up more steam. The Xbox One S was a quieter version of the system with an internal power supply, which was far more convenient and even supported 4K HDR video playback instead of just 1080p, even if the gaming experience was largely the same. But this made the One S a better media device as well, which was a pretty big deal as the general entertainment industry was moving towards a digital distribution. But you can still enjoy your physical Blu-ray movies in a much more enhanced manner. Additionally, the One S came with an upgraded controller that now has Bluetooth support, which made it possible to use it on any Windows 10 PC and tablets without any kind of adapters. In terms of the hardware, Microsoft nailed this revision as they made it a much better version of the original VCR model and selling it for only $299 if you want a 500GB hard drive or $350 for a 1TB hard drive with a launch edition model that came came with a 2TB drive built in for $400. This offered a much better entry-level offering and a much easier to justify highest-end offering with that massive hard drive. But another huge launch related to the Xbox One was the introduction of Gamepass in early 2017. This is a system that offers an alternative method of accessing games, where you pay for a monthly or yearly subscription to access a selection of games, one that grew pretty quickly. This was a pretty great service, where you can try different games or even just play games to their entirety without necessarily having to buy said games, by just renting them off of Microsoft essentially, which made being on the Xbox One more convenient and at times even more affordable. Sony had another service that was pretty similar to this one called PlayStation Plus, where you would also pay for a subscription to get access to both retro and modern games. But Game Pass had a lot more of those modern offerings and even gave you access to new releases from day one, which made it very valuable when compared to Sony's offering. The subscription started at $10 per month and went up to $15 for the highest tier over time. With these two latest offerings from Microsoft, some people became much more curious about how things would improve with the Xbox One, and Microsoft so had a very interesting offering in the making that would shake things up significantly in ways that we have never seen from consoles until this generation. In November 2017, Microsoft launched the greatest hardware revision to their original release yet, the Xbox One X. This appears to be a slightly smaller revision than even the Xbox One S, but packs a lot more power than that one, and this time, I mean it quite literally. This time, the top of this model is completely sealed with matte black plastic, but the Blu-ray drive is the same, and it also features a physical buttons for everything, including the power button, eject button, and pairing button with an IR blaster and USB-A port on the front. The ports on the back are also exactly the same, with a power supply port, two USB-A ports, two HDMI ports for in and out, SPDIF port, IR port, and an Ethernet port. The Xbox One X feels much heavier and much more dense than the One S, even though they look pretty similar, and the exhaust fans have been moved to the back of this unit. The biggest change to the One X is going to be the fact that the internal specs have been upgraded significantly. The Xbox One and One S would mostly play games at 720p, which was decidedly last gen when it comes to video quality, and 1080p was also starting to be left behind in favor of 4K. With the One S, we got 4K video playback support, but with the One X, we would actually play games in 4K HDR. The One S was a great update to the original model, but it maxes out at 1.4 teraflops of processing power, where the Xbox One X has 6 teraflops instead. This is a huge upgrade in terms of raw processing power. However, games didn't just support these features from the get-go, as devs had to go ahead and implement support for these on their already released Xbox One games. And games that did receive this enhancement became much nicer experiences, usually even better than the competitor's PlayStation 4 Pro, which mostly play games at 1080p with higher frame rates. The One X plays games like Red Dead Redemption 2 on the Xbox One at 4K 30 pretty consistently, and something like Final Fantasy 15 has that higher picture quality with higher resolutions, even if it is still locked at 30 FPS. Even in modes where there is an unlocked frame rate, the Xbox One X doesn't quite get to 60 FPS in some games, and obviously not every game can run natively in 4K, but it is still a vast upgrade with better stability than what you will find on the PS4 Pro. With all of these performance upgrades in mind, Microsoft launched the Xbox One X at $500 with a 1TB hard drive. It was considered expensive, but it was a genuine performance upgrade over the lackluster launch model that really made a difference with the many games that did in fact support it. With this model, it was very clear that Microsoft created a beast, and one that really pushed this generation forward and made it much more interesting towards the second half of this console race. However, unfortunately, Microsoft's horrific launch and terrible PR really sent the public perception of their line of systems back. With every new revision that Microsoft launched, Sony already had a similar iteration in the works, and that's why they were already winning. The PS4 Slim was an improved model that was quieter and even cheaper, as it launched at $300. Very similar to the Xbox One S that launched a month earlier. And before Microsoft could launch the One X, Sony already launched their PS4 Pro in November 2016 for $400, 1 year before Microsoft. By then, Sony had a lot of first-party support when brand new titles that were entirely exclusive to the PS4, including Bloodborne, Persona 5 initially, Horizon Zero Dawn, the new God of War, which was great, the revival of the Spider-Man series, and the Shadow of the Colossus remake, Gran Turismo, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Ghost of Tsushima, Uncharted, The Last of Us Part 2 and Part 1, among so many more titles that never made it onto the Xbox One. And all of these were very good, many of which were probably system sellers, while having the vast majority of third-party games that were also on the Xbox One. The sheer library of games and great start that the PlayStation 4 had with no major PR disasters obviously helped it a lot. But the fact that the Wii U was also failing terribly limited the amount of good options for gamers. The Xbox One had a launch that Microsoft never really recovered from, and they really did try to get you to see the Xbox One in an entirely new light. The PlayStation was dominating already by the end of the generation, and Microsoft spent most of it just trying to catch up. By 2018 and 2019, there were so many rumors about the next generation of gaming, even if the PS4 was doing so well. And the Xbox One was crawling its way out of defeat, but the Nintendo Switch also helped a lot in keeping this generation more interesting with the introduction of a fully hybrid system. Now, many gamers were torn between needing high-fidelity games and just ones that were fun, and we got so much variation this generation with the indie scene exploding like never before. Microsoft tried really hard to keep the Xbox One alive, and it shows because the Xbox One did not do too terribly at the end of it all, but it could have easily gone the way of the Wii U if Microsoft hadn't poured every ounce of support that they possibly could. Microsoft sold around 58 million units, while Sony sold nearly double that amount as Sony continued to sell PS4s up until 2022. Microsoft, however, really wanted to move on from the Xbox One and discontinued it in 2020 to focus on the next generation. I sincerely applaud Microsoft for trying as hard as they did to keep the Xbox One going, in spite of the terrible PR, decisions, and choices for their system that almost took place. I would not call the Xbox One a failure, but the truth is that Microsoft's delivery and vision for the Xbox One destroyed a great legacy that could have been even greater this generation. However, this is just one scar that Microsoft will never be able to erase, and they've continued to struggle ever since the initial announcement of the Xbox One. This never really ended. However, Microsoft was getting ready to launch a system with a lot of promise, trying to capitalize on the goodwill that they built throughout the end of the 8th generation, and bringing in a system with so much more potential. However, as of now, it remains to be seen what it will truly become of their latest system. I'm not ready to talk about this system quite yet, so it will take some time before my mini documentary on its successor comes out. However, do make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that mini documentary and many others when they are ready. Now, thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries, and please do consider pressing the hype button on this video to boost it in the algorithm, and sharing it also helps out a ton. Until next time.